Welcome to Farming for Health, where Farmer Lee Jones and I talk with leaders in food, farming, and health and wellness to spread knowledge and inspire a plant forward future, starting now. Welcome to the Farming for Health podcast. I'm Dr. Amy Sapola, joined by Farmer Lee Jones, and we're talking with Chef Brian Levy, who wrote the book Good and Sweet. Brian, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
We're so excited to talk with you, and I would love Farmer to start off with our first question.
Yeah, I mean, it just begs of the question, what inspired you to move into the pastry chef world? I mean, what was the journey to get you there?
Well, well, for starters, I don't call myself a pastry chef. I call myself a pastry cook, or I think in Claire Savitz's words, a dessert person. I mean, that's what she calls herself, not me. But but only because I never, ran the pastry department of a restaurant kitchen or a bakery. I worked in them, but anyway, my journey into desserts was I wanted to write for a food magazine, and like when I was fresh out of college, and I thought experience in a restaurant kitchen would be good for getting me towards that. And I interned at a restaurant in France, and that was like kind of everything in the kitchen. It was at a little bistro, and then I wanted to go specifically into pastry, and I interned at Babbo in New York, where I ended up getting hired and working. And after that, I cooked for families and worked on a few farms, and then went to grad school for architecture, but that was kind of a weird detour.
I saw that in your book. My husband pointed it out this morning. Tell me more about that. What made you interested in like going down that architecture route and then coming back to pastry?
I don't know, it kind of came to me when I was working on the farms. I just wanted to do something different, use like a different part of my brain. And honestly, I had read Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things probably 5 years earlier, and it had just, the thing that sunk in with me about that book most was in her, like, the author bio. It said that she had studied architecture before becoming a novelist, and that just seemed like a nice like journey to me. Yeah, I had never been like a huge architecture fan or anything, but I thought it was something where I'd always you know I'd always been artistic, and with I don't know, I thought the idea of designing kitchens and restaurants was nice, and researching kind of like traditional kitchens and communal kitchens. I I thought in a way it would put together everything that I was interested in and lead me somewhere. And I don't know, it sort of did, it sort of didn't, but 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 it led me into doing digital illustration, which, and I was okay, now I'm really getting off track, but
That's okay.
like some years into that, I started experimenting with this fruit sweetened baking, and that's what brought me back into the kitchen.
Yeah, and I'd love to learn like what really inspired you to write the book and really get into that like fruit inspired baking, because there's not a lot of that out there. Like I haven't really seen that from any other books. So yeah, what was your
Yeah,
inspiration?
yeah, I mean, it really isn't out there, and that's a surprising thing, which I'll get into. But the real moment that kind of it came to me was when I was eating a really sweet mango, and I thought, I have to be able to, there has to be a way to make a dessert out of this without adding sugar to it. Like, it's plenty sweet, and surely I can harness that sweetness and the sweetness in other fruits and other ingredients, that and make sweet enough desserts out of these things without adding sugar to them. So I made a mango custard which worked out well, and I was encouraging, and I moved into other things. Um, I looked for existing recipes that just used fruit and other like inherently sweet ingredients to make desserts sweet, and I really didn't find anything that I was looking for. There's the like reduced sugar recipes. There are things that use kind of alternative sugars like coconut sugar, maple syrup, and honey. And then there were a couple things from the 80s, the 1980s, where now I have to like specify the century, but
Yeah, right.
um, but that used fruit juice concentrate to make things sweet, but that wasn't at all what I want. I wanted something kind of whole food based. And so I just started experimenting, researching ingredients and figuring out what kind of recipes might work. And
Yeah. And did that come out? I know you said you like really appreciated the natural sweetness of that mango. Like, was there like a health aspect to that too? Like a health reason you're trying to do it, or just really to like fully appreciate like whole foods or whole flavors?
I mean, I have, I'm into healthy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is like in my subconscious, but I think more than anything, it was the um, like experimenting and challenge of it that was appealing to me. And yeah, I'm definitely interested in the more healthy, you know, the drawbacks of consuming tons of sugar. I've been into like do you know the blue zones?
Yeah, totally.
So that and like years ago, I saw this documentary on who's the doc who was he was a dentist who
Oh, Weston Price.
is that him
Yep.
who decided that like all the um maybe this was a precursor to the blue zones thing, but like all the healthiest peoples in the world had the best teeth.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was no rotting in their teeth because
Yes.
and probably because they didn't consume sugar.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, just and as I got older, sugar started to have more of an effect on my body. I noticed my like I would wake up feeling kind of hungover after eating too much sugar. And
Mm-hmm.
so yes, that is a part of it that I'm interested in.
Yeah, and I think so many other people are too. It's always the question of like how, because I think we've all had those experiments of like adding whatever substitute sugar and it turns out terribly. And I know your journey was a long one to get to where you are now as far as getting these recipes like created and using the whole form and not going with like the coconut sugar and all of that. Why did you choose to not use like those alternative sugars?
So some like coconut sugar and other things like maple syrup and agave, and they just don't they're not nutritionally, they're not different enough from cane sugar to make them interesting to me. And they're also in terms of just setting a challenge for myself, it's not that hard to replace cane sugar with those things. And I wanted, and then there are the things like stevia and monk fruit, and which I looked at all those, but the thing with sweeteners, which I'm putting in quotes, is even if they're like naturally derived sweeteners like stevia and monk fruit, they almost always have something added to them in the packaged form. Um, and I couldn't expect readers to grow their own stevia and monk fruit, which is actually, I mean, something I considered doing. I considered like growing. I'm like, do I need to grow stevia? I'm like, but I can't have, expect readers to do that. And then yeah, I also just wanted to keep away from sweeteners, like things that their only function is to make things sweet, or to make your to trick your taste buds. Or I wanted things to I wanted ingredients that I would use to um, bring flavors as well, in
Yeah.
addition to sweetness.
Yeah. I love that. And
I'm really curious, Amy, if I can interrupt, the
sure.
refractometer and the bricks were you measuring the bricks in the product? Because we see the difference in a melon. There can be one that's at 3 bricks, or one that's at 16, or a carrot. Did that become your intimate friend? Was a refractometer during this process, or not really?
No.
No.
I read about refractometers, but I don't actually have one, didn't use one. I um because I didn't so it, there's a lot of dried fruits that I rely on, which are more consistent in their sweetness. Yeah, I wanted it to be. I do use fresh fruits, and I explain in the book how to tell if something's the ripeness that we're looking for, um, which would which would if it's the peak ripeness, it's the sweetness that we're
Right.
expecting it to be. One thing I did use to test, kind of more like chemistry wise, I did use iodine when I was testing the conversion of starches to sugars, in because there's some advice I give in the book for naturally converting the starches in bananas to sugars, and you can test for that with iodine.
Oh,
It go
interesting.
it goes if I'm remembering correctly, it goes black if there is starch present. But that's something I learned from Stella Parks,
Huh.
from reading Stella Parks, which is the enzyme in egg yolks helps convert starches into sugars. So, like in my banana bread, I suggest that if your bananas aren't exactly to the point of like over ripeness that you want them to be at for making banana bread, you can kind of you can kind of cheat by mixing them with the eggs that are in the recipe and letting them sit for just half an hour.
Oh my gosh. I've never heard that. That is so cool.
Yeah.
And that's, I know you were talking about freeze dried fruit too, and you had a different technique for like making it not get like soggy, right? And it seems like
Yeah.
you really brought a lot of chemistry knowledge in. And as someone who loves science, I was like totally nerding out on like all of the great chemistry in your book. But yeah, do you want to just tell us a little bit about that too?
Yeah, I love good sidebar fun facts. But the thing you're talking about with the freeze-dried fruit not getting soggy or not sucking up all the moisture from a recipe, which it wants to do because it's full of fiber. So I it struck me that maybe I could use Rose Levy Berenbaum's reverse creaming method, which she uses to prevent gluten development. But I thought maybe I could use it to coat the freeze dried fruit in fat, so that it wouldn't absorb all the moisture from a recipe. And anyway, that ended up working very well and helping, letting me use freeze powdered, or I pulverize freeze dried fruits in a lot of the recipes. And it this method helped me use them without, you know, destroying the texture of recipes.
Yeah. One of the things people might be wondering is like where do you find freeze-dried fruit? Like is that pretty readily available? I know that's not something commonly like
Yeah, no, it
as common, I
actually,
guess.
once you start looking for it, you realize that it kind of is readily available. And it
Oh,
almost makes
cool.
me wonder, like, what if people, like, if you're not writing a book that uses a lot of freeze-dried fruit, what are people using all this freeze-dried fruit for? But yeah, it's kind of, so I first got it in like my local health food store. And
Okay.
then but now I notice I mean, it's in Trader Joe's, it's
Yeah.
in Target, it's in all these big stores. I also use as an alternative to freeze dried apples. I use the baked chips, which are
Mm-hmm.
also kind of everywhere. I noticed them at the airport the other day. Um, and yeah, they're it's pretty easy to find freeze dried fruit these days.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So on the inside cover of your book, I love that bottom paragraph where you say that sweets like these ones that nudge you towards mindful preparation and eating, but don't compromise flavor, will make you feel good about dessert. And I am very passionate about mindful eating, and I notice like a component of mindfulness to your work. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Well, dessert in general, I think is like not a necessity and it's meant to be enjoyed and savored. So I think that's very connected with mindfulness. And I think it's uh, the hope would be to enjoy each step of the process, like reading the
Mm-hmm.
recipes and reading, all the other tidbits about ingredients, and then the collecting the ingredients and the process of making a recipe. I just think the enjoyment of each step is important, and I can't claim that I always am, calm and living in the very moment when I'm baking, but I guess I strive to. And and then just the ingredients themselves that I use, I think is a lot about mindfulness. Like I don't know if I'm stretching the definition of mindfulness here, but I want to be aware of what I'm putting in the cake or whatever. In a recipe, I want to be aware of like what each ingredient is. And when you're using cups full of granulated sugar, you don't really think about where that came from. But when you're using the ingredients that I use in this book, like whether it's dates or freeze dried blueberries or dried white mulberries, you see the individual little fruits, and
Mm-hmm.
before you grind them up or puree them or chop them or whatever, you see that you just have more of a connection, I think, with them as a fruit or vegetable or grain or whatever that someone grew somewhere and put effort into. And that's part of why I put the fruit files in throughout the book, which are I kind of highlight the star ingredients in the book and give background information, the ripeness information, botanical relationships. But I also just want there to be some awareness of like where these things are grown and where they might have, you know, been shipped from or whatever. Uh, I didn't even know that pineapple. I thought before I was, and maybe I'm in the minority here, but I thought pineapples grew on some kind of palm tree, and they don't. They grow in like an aloe looking plant, that is in the ground, and uh yeah, I just think for ingredients that we're so used to, I just wanted to have more of an idea of where they actually come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so powerful to have that connection with the food in its whole form, with the growers, like to have a reverence for what you're eating and what you're making. And I think at one point in the book you said if baking is torture for you, there's a subtle background flavor of torture, which I thought I connected with that. And I think part of it is just the experience of like enjoying the process and enjoying, what you're doing.
Yeah.
And people can taste that. I think we all think of like our grandmas, whatever, like the love that goes into the preparation is huge.
Hmm.
And it's certainly one of the greatest compliments we can get as farmers at the farm when a chef says, "We can taste the love that you put into
Yeah.
it on your end," and that's just like the greatest compliment we can ever hear. So it's so relatable what you're saying, and I appreciate it so much. What you're saying makes perfect sense from a grower standpoint.
Yeah, I'm sure. When I go to pick up I just joined a CSA this summer for
Oh,
the first
great.
time, and when I pick stuff up from my local farmer, Renee, I end up like talking to her for 15 minutes every time I pick a box up and, you know, going into the greenhouse and seeing what she's excited about. And it just makes you excited to use those ingredients.
Oh, yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely.
I'm really curious about the lick the spoon, not just because it's fun. One of those guys that fought to lick the spoon as a kid. But you say not just because it's fun, because it's important. I'm so curious about that one sentence in the book.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has tasted cookie dough, but I think savory cooks are always encouraged to taste as they go, taste as they cook, and you'd never serve a dish without having tasted it first, kind of at every step. And I don't think uh, pastry people are encouraged to do as much tasting. And you are, in a way, you are following a formula. You're like sticking more closely to a recipe uh, when you're doing a dessert. But I think just in terms of preventing, you can still overlook things that are in recipes, and sometimes save yourself from a disaster and crystallizing that disaster by baking whatever you're making. You can prevent that by tasting your batter or dough or whatever and realizing that you forgot to put the salt in it, or you forgot to in another outside of this book you might have forgotten to put the sugar in. Like you hear about that kind of thing happening all the time. And if you just taste things along the way, you can prevent a lot of those problems. Also, I just like knowing, what something tastes like in its raw state versus what it tastes like after you bake it, and what the relationship between those things is.
I
Every
think
chef I've ever seen in the kitchen is always tasting in the process along the way to see where they're at, know what else it needs, and of course, a new spoon every time.
Yes.
Well, I am very curious. You haven't mentioned it, but I'm seeing more and more vegetables working their way into pastry. And I'm excited about that, obviously, because we're vegetable people here on the farm. And, just kind of wondered what kind of work you've done. I've seen beets used a lot over the years, but, we're seeing carrots and other vegetables, from a health standpoint and just from I think that they can be really good, and I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are, what kind of work you've done with them.
Yeah, I think from a health standpoint, from them being good, and from often you have an overabundance of certain crops in the summer, so you want to figure out everything you can possibly do with them,
Yeah,
um, namely zucchini. um, but yeah, I don't have a ton of vegetables in the book, but I do have a zucchini uh, cake, a zucchini olive oil spice cake, which is one of my favorite recipes. And it's not revolutionary to use zucchini in a cake or a sweet bread, but um, yeah, it's a that's a great ingredient. And I also use sweet potato flour. I found to be a good ingredient used in moderation, because it actually, when I was first trying things out with it, it can easily overpower uh, a dish. So I use it I have a persimmon bunt cake that I use a little bit of sweet potato flour in, that complements that persimmon flavor, and just, the fall spices. And then one of the things I was most excited about during my course of ingredient finding was freeze-dried sweet corn.
Really?
Yeah. Which, so one of the things, and the reason I rely on dried and freeze-dried things more than fresh is, although I'll use fresh fruits it's like the star ingredient of for a tart or whatever. I have a peaches and cream brioche tart, and of course there are fresh peaches on that, but the kind of struggle in using fruit to make things sweet is all the moisture that it brings when you're using fresh fruit. So using dried fruit just makes more sense. Yeah.
And with the freeze-dried sweet corn, like what are you doing with it? I love the flavor of sweet corn, and I think to be able to preserve that sweetness and like wonderful flavor, what sort of recipes are you using that for?
So I use freeze-dried sweet corn in biscuits, which then I use those biscuits also for strawberry shortcake. I also use it in a rosemary lemon shortbread. And freeze-dried sweet corn so as a pastry person, I've of course used a lot of cornmeal and corn flour before, and I was always kind of disappointed by the lack of intensity in terms of corn flavor. And when I came across freeze-dried sweet corn, it really is like that intense summer sweet corn flavor and aroma that you really want when you're making a corn centric thing. And it brings the sweetness too. You probably know that there's dent corn and there's sweet corn, and dent corn is what's used to make polenta and cornmeal and corn flour, and it just doesn't have the same sweetness or flavor that the sweet corn.
More starchy, right?
Yeah. And it doesn't have that same sweetness and flavor of the sweet corn that we eat off the cob. So grinding up the freeze-dried sweet corn actually brings that flavor of like fresh sweet corn into a recipe that just putting cornmeal in it does not bring. So like with the sweet corn buttermilk biscuits, like they really just have the flavor of sweet corn kind of concentrated in them, which I love.
Yeah.
I'm hungry now. That sounds so good. We opened a farm market in response to COVID to open up to the community and to try and really make people or get people to think about seasonality. You can go anywhere in the country and get an apple fritter pretty much 12 months a year. And so we've been having fun with changing up the fritters. I think we did carrot fritter and we did peach fritter, zucchini fritter. Right now we're on beet fritter. I don't know, the color seems to be making people a little leery. They're like, it looks almost like an organ or something. It's just really intense red. It's not, I don't know, they did not sell. We gave away like as many as we sold this Saturday, trying to get people to actually try them. But I don't know, I think we're going to switch off of beet fritter pretty quickly. What do you think about sweet potato fritter? It seems we're digging our first sweet potatoes on the farm today. So
that seems
that
perfect.
Would work?
Yeah. And that, of course, I mentioned sweet potato flour earlier, but you could definitely make the fritter. You could definitely make the fritter with the fresh, mashed sweet potato.
Yeah.
I'd like to try that.
I almost say it's got to sell better than the beets.
Are they savory, these fritters?
They're sweet. Yeah.
Okay.
And they're big. They're massive. We sell them for $6 retail at the farm market, and we chop the ingredients and send the pulp and the juice and send it over to a guy, and he does them at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then he brings them out to the farm market. They're still warm when they get there.
Oh, nice.
So,
Well,
so
I would have tried to beat one.
Yeah, I was gonna say beets can be kind of polarizing. Some people love them and some people hate them, but I love
exactly.
beets so much. So yeah, I always say I think beets taste like chocolate, and my husband thinks they taste like dirt. So we're both camps, you know?
Well, chocolate tastes a little like dirt.
Yeah, right? Exactly. See? But so as far as bees go, I know you don't use honey, but you do use bee pollen, and we have like 40 beehives here on the farm, so we love our bees. Can you tell us about how you're using bee pollen and like why bee pollen to bring that sweetness?
Yeah, so I'm fascinated by everything that bees produce.
Yeah.
And bee pollen is, well, for starters, when you're not using uh, cane sugar to uh, garnish things, it's easy to rely on, powdered sugar or sprinkles or turbinado raw sugar to garnish things. Um, and you have to get creative when you're not using those things. So bee pollen, just for its like color and um, shape and size, was just seemed like a great thing to sprinkle over things. I call it the sprinkles of the whole food world. And um, and it has a very subtle sweetness because there's some nectar that glues the pollen balls together. Um, but it's really just a lot of kind of floral honey flavor without all the sweetness. And there's actually a lot of protein in it, and probably a bunch of other vitamins. But I really just think it's pretty
Mhm.
and and
Yeah.
has a nice aroma and subtle flavor. And talk about mindfulness. Bees put a lot of work into producing those little pellets, so I don't like to waste a single one of them.
Mhm. Yeah, so well said. That's one of the things we started making last year was like flour sprinkles as well, just like literally dried flowers that we grow and
Hmm.
drying them down and then kind of making them in smaller pieces and
Oh,
using
that's a
them as a
great idea.
sprinkle. But
Yeah.
it's a nice, because you still want the element of like fun and color and, like something exciting, but not necessarily all the artificial colors. My kids just went to an apple farm and they bought a caramel apple there. And like when I think of caramel, I think of like cream, sugar, butter, probably, right? Maybe salt, maybe vanilla. The ingredient list was so super long, and there was like palm oil and all these artificial colors. I'm like, why is this in a caramel apple, right? And so when
Do you know?
in your book
I
I saw you have a recipe, and last night my son was like freaking out about it when we were reading through the book, and it's so like it sounds so delicious and it seems so easy. And so I think it is getting back to like those whole foods and kind of appreciating like the simplicity and the flavors and not needing like 500 ingredients to make caramel, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you brought the caramel apple up because that I love caramel, and I was never a candy apple person. I always liked a caramel apple.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that like it really just, I hate to say it tastes like, because it is it is a real thing, but it really tastes like a delicious caramel, that like a creamy, salty caramel. And yeah, like you said, the ingredients list is very small and very wholesome. It's like dates and milk powder, I
I
think
think there was
miso.
I was gonna say, I think there's miso. And can you talk about using miso? I don't think of that in dessert as much.
Yeah, so when you're when you're trying to make caramel is a pretty complex flavor, and so there you have to kind of think of the bitterness and the sweetness and the umami that's in it and make up all of those elements with other things when you're not using cane sugar. So miso was one of those things that that brings like a delicious umami, of course, uh, flavor to. I used it in other like there's a apple custard tart where you just want it just brings a caramel undertone that is delicious.
Yeah, I saw it in the picture. There's like a picture of it in a jar, and I was like, seriously, I want to just keep this jar in my refrigerator. Like, I just could
Yeah,
put that
and
on
I
everything. It sounds so good.
yeah, and I do keep it in the refrigerator.
Do
And you can
you?
even like it's such a the texture of it is such that you really can you could roll it into little caramel balls or cubes and eat it like wrap it like caramel candies. That'd be a
Oh my
good
gosh.
Halloween thing.
Yeah, right. I know. That's yeah, I love the variety in your book too of like there's some very simple like no bake type of options and then there's like more complex like cakes and things like that. But I love that variety. I also love that there's breakfast options cuz often when you think of breakfast pastry it's so like cloyingly sweet that you're like, "Whew, really really sweet." But I thought having the breakfast options that still have like nutritious like whole food um, sweetness to them was really a nice change.
Yeah, I've always been more of a sweet breakfast person, um but I don't necessarily want something soaked in sugar and maple syrup for to start my morning off. Um,
Yeah, right.
but yeah, and in terms of the like levels, the variation of levels of complexity that you mentioned, one of my favorite recipes in the book is a black and white milkshake. I think it's like one of the last recipes in the book, and it's just putting a few ingredients in the blender and just blending them, and it's it's a delicious milkshake. And so there's things like that all the way to like fancy tartlets that are probably intimidating.
I don't remember the right name, but they look like fig Newtons. And I was like,
Hmm.
oh, those look delicious. Like, but for me, that looks kind of hard. But they look
Yeah,
so good.
yeah, I call them new fake tins.
Yes, there you
Um,
go.
um, but yeah, I've always been a big fan of fig Newtons, and I don't those aren't too hard.
Okay, good.
You just
Maybe,
need you do need a piping bag, but
yeah. I might venture into them eventually.
yeah.
I'll start with some easier ones.
All right. Try the Babylonian swirls first.
Ooh, that looks really good too. Why are those like a good starting place? Or like, why would you start with those first?
Well, because like you do have to make a dough and you do have to make a filling, but it's less tools, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It's just there's yeast in the dough, but it's not that important. Like it's not like I don't know. When my mom was making those, she was like, "Oh, I haven't made something with yeast in years. I'm scared." But it's really, I mean, it doesn't make it's not like making a sourdough. I mean, you just
Yeah.
need to make sure you don't kill the yeast by, you know, making putting it in really hot liquid or something. Um, and then yeah, it's just a matter of rolling the dough out, spreading the filling on it, which is just a puree of like dates and cardamom and sesame seeds, and then you roll them up, cut them, and they make your kitchen smell so good. And those are one of the recipes that really didn't require a lot of adaptation because the traditional recipe doesn't have sugar added to it in the first place. It's like in the reason I call them Babylonian swirls is because they're this ancient recipe um, from Babylon. Um, but in modern day Iraq, they're called klesha. Um, but yeah, in that part of the world, there are lots of things that, just use dates as a filling that, of course, doesn't need any sugar added to it because dates are so sweet.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds so good. Cardamom's one of my favorite flavors, especially during this season where you
Yeah.
want those like warming spices. So,
Yeah. And
yeah.
cardamom smells so good whenever you're baking with it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely. What was one of the most surprising things along your journey to writing this book?
Um, Maybe the ingredients that ended up not being as useful as I thought they would be, and the ones that ended up being way more useful than I expected them to be. Like, uh, I think I thought I'd use a lot more dried apricots, pineapple, and um, even the sweet potato flour that I mentioned. But with each of those ingredients, the flavors can get really overpowering really easily. So, like, especially with the pineapple, I was testing out freeze dried pineapple recipes early on in my tests, and it just really had a it would really overpower a recipe in a with a flavor that I won't describe here, but it's not good. and and then with things like apricots, like fresh apricots have a much more subtle flavor than once you dry them, and it's it's not just the concentration of the flavor, but it's also the effect that whatever heat, I guess, is applied to them during the drying process. Um, it just makes their flavor really intense. And I do use them, but I always balance them with other things like raisins and dates, that will kind of put them in the background. Uh, Sweet potato flour, like I said earlier, can quickly overpower a recipe. And then there were things that discoveries along the way, like the freeze dried sweet corn and dried white mulberries, that were just kind of revelations for me. When I came across, I had never tasted a dried white mulberry before, and when I first tasted them, just on their own as a snack, they just have a delicious flavor. They're pretty closely related to figs. So, and once you know that, you can kind of see and taste the connection. It's like a mini candified kind of fig. Um, and they just have a great chewy, crunchy texture. And then just the story behind them is really fascinating too. White mulberry trees, the leaves of white mulberry trees are pretty much the only thing that silkworms eat. So wherever there's a silk industry, there are white mulberry trees. And so the white mulberries that you get dried tend to come from countries that have a silk industry.
Oh, that's fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Huh.
And one thing one thing I also learned along the way was, we've there are lots of mulberry streets in the United States. Um, so I wondered why don't why aren't these dried white mulberries coming from here? And a couple centuries ago, when they started planting mulberry trees here, I think they bred them to not produce fruit. So
Oh,
that's why we
sure.
have the trees and not the fruit.
Oh, super interesting. And that's, I love the red, like the purpley mulberries. I used to live in Wisconsin and they were all around. And I don't
Mhm.
know if you've ever worked with those, but those are one of my favorite berries, to be honest. They're so delicious. And I buy my kids the dried white mulberries too. And like you said, they're a great flavor and they have that like crunchiness and chewiness. And they're amazing. But
Yeah, I actually am ashamed to say I don't think I've ever had a fresh red or
yeah.
white mulberry,
Oh.
and I'd really next summer I need to seek them out.
Come to Wisconsin. I'll show you where they are.
Okay.
We've got them here too. They're
Yeah,
all along the
see?
creek sides of the creeks. It seems like the birds know the day before we're ready to pick them, and they
Yes.
go in and wipe them out. So
Do they grow? Do they grow like really long? Like, is the berry itself really long?
There's different varieties, but
Yeah.
I planted one in my yard that is really long berries. But there's
Mm.
some, like the ones I find like out in the, along the edge of the woods are usually a little shorter. But Lee, what do
Okay.
we have here? I don't even know. That's a good.
yeah, I mean, we see them along the creek beds all the time. I mean, they're kind of considered a scrub tree around
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. I know. They're so unappreciated, but at least in my world, I think they're delicious. So,
Well, I definitely like the dried ones.
yeah. So our podcast is called Farming for Health. And when you think of farming for health, what does that mean to you?
I mean, I think their farming and health are like inextricably linked.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you can have one without the other. The most important thing for our health is what we're putting in our bodies, and farms are where that stuff should come from. Just thinking about it, like in relation to the podcast as its title, I was thinking like you guys are kind of farming for health in the sense of farming as like the subcontracting
Oh, yeah.
connotation, or of like you're looking for ideas via people out there who
Yeah.
Mm.
I know.
I like
Maybe
it.
it has a double meaning. Who knows?
I love your answer.
Yeah,
Well,
I do
thank you.
too.
It's so exciting to have you on. I really enjoyed this. I felt like a bystander a little bit to this, but I mean, just fascinating. The book is amazing, and I just really appreciate your passion for growing. I think it's so revolutionary to think about not having to add the sugars. If plants are grown healthy and grown in balance, you can get those natural sugars and natural flavors. And Dr. Amy, I mean, are diabetics having the same problems with natural sugars as they do the additive sugars? I'm
So-
just curious to know about that.
Yeah, so they'll probably have a lower glycemic impact because you're likely still including all the fiber. So the sugars are going to be in their whole form. So it's coming along with all the other nutrients. You'll likely still see an impact on blood sugar. Like you can't get away from the fact that there's some natural sugar there, but
Sure.
with the fiber and all the other things, you'll likely have a lower glycemic impact.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear you say that because I'm of course not a nutritionist or a doctor, but from what I have read, that was what I understood to be the case, was that because these ingredients I use, the sugars are accompanied by all these other nutrients, it slows down the processing of them in your bloodstream.
Yep,
Right.
That's exactly right. And I think there's so much to be said for like the wisdom of whole food and all of the things. Like we really like to get down to like, this one, like the macronutrient or the micronutrient, but there's thousands of phytochemicals in like a vegetable and, all these other nutrients that we haven't even studied. And so using foods in their whole form versus like one single derivative just brings so much more wisdom and complexity that I think our bodies appreciate. Any final thoughts from anyone?
Just I think everyone should go have a spoonful of bee pollen.
Yeah, I love it.
And lick the spoon.
And lick
Yeah.
the spoon. Well, Brian, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you for listening to Farming for Health. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. Connect with Farmer Lee Jones and I on Instagram and Facebook.